Hello everyone and welcome back to this second podcast on paper writing. So in this podcast I will talk about how to structure an academic paper. And you might already have been presented to some of this in the previous material, so some of it might seem familiar. And again, I just want, before I start to announce a small disclaimer. This is, in this podcast, of course, my view on things. Others, especially academics in other fields, might have other views. So see this as one perspective within many, and be critical to what you hear and what you do yourself, and try to find your own way in working with this paper assignment. Writing an academic paper is about communicating a new piece of knowledge as clearly and precisely as possible. While there is no singular way of doing this, there are still formats and structure conventions that are expected to be followed. If one wishes to deviate from these guidelines, there needs to be good reasons for doing so, and it can also be expected to be met with some skepticism from readers and reviewers. The reason for having a tight and well-structured standard when doing a paper is because it makes it easier for others to quickly assess and understand the paper's content, but also simply because it is an effective way of communicating and building the sufficient argumentation and the silver lining that enables the reader to evaluate the knowledge claim in the paper. Depending on the field of study and tradition, what is perceived as conventional paper structure might differ a bit. To get a sense of this, you might look at other papers in different journals to see how they're structured. Mostly papers tend to follow the IMRD format, which stands for Introduction, Methods, Results and Discussion. This is the core of the paper. Then normally you have some additional but equally important elements such as title, abstract, conclusion or closing remarks, acknowledgements and literature lists. I will now briefly go through each of these just to highlight and introduce very briefly what normally are put into these different elements. So the first one is title. The title is the first thing the reader sees when deciding if she or he wants to spend time on reading it. So a good rule of thumb is to make it short, precise, and as accurate as possible. The second element is the abstract. The abstract gives the reader a very brief rundown of the content of the paper. This is a deal-breaker moment for the reader. Is it worth spending time on or not? So keep it short and precise, and try to use as many as the most important concepts or keywords within the paper in the abstract. Normally an abstract is about 100 to 200 words. Introduction. For many students, writing the introduction is the first part of the process, setting down the direction of the paper and laying out exactly what the research paper is trying to achieve. For others, the introduction is the last thing written, acting as a quick summary of the paper. As long as you've planned a good structure of the parts of a research paper, both methods are equally good, and it is a matter of preference. A good introduction should generally include, firstly, a general presentation of the research problem, and then you should lay out exactly what you're trying to achieve with this particular research paper or research project, and then you should state your own position. And I will get back to these matters about doing a good introduction in another podcast. Then we have methods. This should be the easiest part of the paper to write, as it is a rundown of the exact design and methodology used to perform the research. Obviously, the exact methodology varies depending on the exact field and type of experiment or research that you're doing. In the natural sciences, this part of the paper ensures that another researcher should be able to replicate the experiment exactly and thereby test knowledge claims in the paper. In the paper you are more likely to do. This part ensures that the reader will have a thorough and clear picture of what you have done, how you have done it, and why you have done it, creating transparency to the knowledge claims that you present later on. You can assume that anybody reading your paper is familiar with all the basic methods, so try not to explain every last detail. Results. This is probably the most variable part of any research paper and depends upon the results and the type of research that you're doing. This is where you put forward your findings, present your empirical data. It might be survey data, literature reviews, theory, observations, and so on. And it is a chance to give a general overview for the reader to understand your material. The result part of the paper often comprises a lot of stuff ranging from introduction of concepts and theory, laying out empirical data, starting up analysis, and so on. This also means that the result part is not necessarily only one section in the paper. Often it is chopped into several self-standing sections depending on what makes sense in relation to the particular paper and story you want to tell. And here again, you might look into other papers. What have they done? How have they done it? And why have they done it? Also, the section should not be named result, obviously, but rather something more meaningful that is telling the reader what is inside this section. Remember, these headlines of sections in the paper, and here I'm not only talking about the result, but all through the paper are signposts signaling both content but also hinting the more overall silver lining of the paper. Therefore, it is always a good exercise to take out all these headlines and read them after one another to gain a sense if they themselves tell a story. Discussion. In some fields of academia, there's a very strict division between results and discussion, the first being an objective presentation of findings and empirical data, and the latter being the place in which the researcher presents his or her own personal interpretation and analysis of the data. In the social sciences and humanities, and I like to think also in urban design, this line is far more blurred. In fact, in presenting results, you have already chosen to show something, highlight particular details or parts of the empirical material, and therefore interpretation and analysis is already starting to take place on some level. But in general, this last part here, the discussion, is where you have a chance to elaborate on your findings and explain what you found, adding your own personal interpretation. Ideally, you should link this discussion back to the introduction, the focus of the paper, and the motivation of the story. And if you recall the last podcast where we talked about the why is this particular thing that this paper is about, why is that important, the discussion should of course deal with that. It is important to try to make sure that every piece of information in your discussion is related directly to the thesis statement, or you risk clouding your findings. You can expand upon the topic in the conclusion if needed. Remember, this is kind of an hourglass principle, so it's open in the beginning, then it gradually squeezes in, and then you can open up more in the end. Conclusion. The conclusion should first of all summarize the content of the paper. This needs to be done with precision and briefly tying everything together and revisiting the research question. And this needs to be done in such a way that the reader doesn't feel that he or she is going through the whole thing again. And secondly, the conclusion is where you build upon your discussion or your analysis and try to refer your findings to other research and to the world at large. Some research papers require a recommendation section postulating that further directions of the research, as well as highlighting how any flaws affected the results, and in this case you should suggest any improvements that could be made to the research design. And in a later podcast I will go a bit more into detail with how to write a good conclusion. Okay, so the two last elements, acknowledgement and references, I think this is fairly obvious what should go into these. Of course, no paper is complete without the reference list. This is where you document all the sources that you have used in the research, and each journal will have directions to which reference styles should be used. In relation to reference in general, I will be doing, I think it will be the last podcast in this series on how to reference correctly, because I think this is a very important matter in academic writing. So summarizing these different elements or parts that go into the paper structure, we can take a look at this list. So abstract, what is that about? You can ask yourself the question, what did I do in a nutshell? The introduction is about what is the problem. The methods is about how did I solve this problem, and the results is about what did I find out, of course, and the discussion is about what does it mean, and the acknowledgements are about who helped me in doing this work, and of course the literature list is about whose work did I refer to in this work. So before we end, I have made this small exercise for you, and with this background understanding of what a standard paper structure is, I want you to analyze an existing paper. So find a paper that you like or involves some of the themes or topics that you're working with in your paper, read it to yourself, and as you go through it, try to identify the different elements or parts that needs to go into the paper structure. And as we've talked about, they might not use the same words for the same elements, but I'm pretty sure when you do this, you will find that all of the parts are there, but maybe of course not in the same order, or maybe they have been divided differently. So you might ask yourself while doing this, how is this particular paper structured, and why is it structured the way it is? And then of course what is working and what is not working well in relation to communicating and do a good job of convincing with the knowledge claim in the paper. Lastly, it is important to understand that what matters in papers is not only the content, but of course also the form. How is it presented, and how is the paper sold? With the immense amount of literature out there in academia, things need to be to the point and easily communicated to be heard and cared about. This means that writing your paper and structuring it is about both, following the conventions, but also very much about increasing readability, making it easier and maybe even enjoyable for the readers to read. So this concludes this podcast, and thank you for listening.